Hi guys, my name is Atlanta Proctor, and for my research report today, I will be presenting 3 decades of sexual content on primetime programming, a longitudinal meta-analytic review by Amir Hetsroni. I chose this article for this research report for 2 reasons. One, because it connects back to our assignment from this week over the sample article, and this is actually the sample article that I used for the assignment this week over meta-analysis. Just because it's fresh from my brain and I've read the whole article and it just seemed the perfect time to do it. Second reason that I chose this article is that it kind of relates to my research prompt that I'm using this semester over censorship, because this article discusses the frequency of sexual content on television, and I think that very much goes along with censorship because this article discusses um, how the decline of sexual content or the increase of it, the people that were critiquing and criticizing sexual content in television and why they were doing that and where they were getting their information, and then the networks that were fighting this, that were allowing the sexual content and even pushing the boundaries by adding more sexual content, until ratings had to be forced upon them. So this absolutely coincides with the ideal of censorship. So that's really interested me in the first place. So the point of this study was to find out if sexual content on American primetime programming had either increased or decreased over the span of 3 decades. So the study goes over studies that were done from 1974 all the way to 2004. Yeah. So Hetsroni starts the article after introducing it by saying why he thinks this study is important. And he goes on to say that children get most of their sexual education from the programming on television that they see, that they are so reliant on television that the only means that they are learning about this, about sex and the sexual education and STDs and safe sex and everything that we're exposed to, is through television. However, there is very few information on STDs and practicing safe sex and so on. So he couldn't really insinuate if it was benefiting them or harming them, but too much of it in not the right way, he said, did lead to some very harmful effects in children and teens. However, he did say that while the times are changing and things are allowable, that television was also changing with these sociocultural changes, like seeing more women in the workplace on television, and not only just in the workplace, but also in managerial positions. And then also in changes of television for sociocultural things, such as seeing more homosexuality on TV. And so he said that that was a benefit, one of the benefits from children watching TV so much also. One statistic that really stuck out to me in this research article was from Planned Parenthood in 1987 that stated over 2/3 of Americans think that popular show encouraged teenagers to become sexually active too early. And so that was another point of him doing this research, is because critics that were saying that there's an overflow of sexual content on TV, he wanted to find out if the messages that these critics were spreading, if they were based off factual evidence, and he wanted to counter that or find that if that was true. So in this article, in his research, he analyzes 25 different studies comprised from 20 publications, and combined, these publications analyze over 2,558 hours of programmed television, from the 4 major broadcast networks: ABC, NBC, Fox, and CBS. With his research, his basic unit of measurement is the mean frequency per hour that a sexual content is seen or heard. In his article, Hetsroni explains that not only does he use peer-reviewed articles, but when he was searching for these studies, he was just typing in every search engine, sexual content analysts, analyzing content review, all of that, because he also wanted articles that weren't peer-reviewed, and he just wanted any sort of studies, which is one of the main reasons that he uses the meta-analytic review technique, is because he basically said that no matter like how unreliable the source was, once he gathered all that information, it was all leveled out at the end. Like if there was flaws, the information was still there by this process of meta-analysis, and so then by the end of it, it did have reliable information. For his results, he found that most of the for his research questions, most of them had decreased, like the normative sexual content, the frequency of prostitution, or illicit sexual content, and regarding messages of STDs and safe sex, all of those had decreased since 1974. The only research question that he posed that had increased over the 3 decades was the appearance of culturally illegitimate sexual behavior, that is, homosexuality. So I found that really surprising, actually, with these findings, because I expected the sexual content to have increased, and this was just a hypothesis of my own that I came from reading this article, just because I feel like in today's society, we're more allowing of such conversations, and we're more open to having conversations, and then seeing it in a setting produced by actors and so on. I just felt like we would be more allowable to that, but according to this, all of that has decreased except for the appearance of homosexuality on television. He does go to explain, though, that like, even though homosexuality is shown more on TVs now, that it's not really deemed super sexual content because it's only like kissing and some touching. Like it's never actually the act of sex. So his study states that the findings contradict those who criticize the media for being over-sexualized. And so then he goes to deduct what can explain these contradictions still. Like, why are people still arguing that there is still explicit sexual content on television programs when these studies show that they are decreasing? And he just goes to say that there's 2 reasons, and one of them being is that the critics doubt the reliability and the validity of the results. And the second is that even if the results are there, they're still just not going to acknowledge the truth. They still just believe what they believe and think that it's still explicit, basically. And then he does like a brief history of how sexual content got into television and like how it was fought. And he explains that the sexual revolution started in the 1960s, but we as Americans didn't start seeing it on TV until the 1970s. And even though it was introduced into television, though, it came with immediate backlash from religious protesters and conservative media groups like the Coalition for Better TV and Parents Television Council. These groups called for a ban of advertisers, for viewers to ban or boycott the advertisers that were paying these networks. And so this boycott happened, and it actually worked, but it only sent younger viewers to look for these in different areas. So like this was the time that HBO came out, and that was like a different sort of separate paid programming that did allow sexual content to be broadcasted even more, if anything, with shows like Sex and the City. However, some networks still decided to test the waters and kind of ignore these protesters and whatever the advertisement bans, and they still did controversial sexual content situations, so be it on shows like Murphy Brown, where they decided to have a single mother raise a child after she got pregnant, and then shows like Buffy the Vampire Slayer, where she was having relations with vampires and she was a human being. Um, so, of course, there was a huge backlash from this as well, and um, because of this, the Telecommunications Act of 1996 required programs to label violent scenes and sexual content. This, in the end, this didn't seem to be a problem for the networks. They had no problem doing this because it kind of created a forbidden fruit aspect, and it kind of just pushed people to watch it even more because it enticed them to their shows, and so it wasn't really a big deal in the end. Um, so to review, he goes back to talking about homosexuality and how that came back, how that was the only increase in television, and even though it was minuscule, it was still a big step towards um, allowing such things and realizing that they're not so explicit and that that was a good thing. Shows like Will and Grace. And then towards the end of his research article, he calls for future research to be done. And I think this is mainly because the definition of sexual content and how us as an audience perceive sexual content and what we might get offended by, I feel like that's something that's constantly changing. We're more acceptable of things, and like I said earlier, like more willing to have conversations and be more informed on these situations. So homosexuality is just the beginning of it, and so he says that like whether we're talking about sex like humorously or with seriousness, it's still important that it happens, and so that's why he calls for future research. So I guess a couple of what I could pose as a question to you guys would be like, were you surprised by the results like I was? Because I definitely didn't expect a decrease in the sexual content from the 1970s. I expected an increase just because of what we're more allowable with. And so yeah, thanks.